Chapter 8. Defending the Throne. Anselm and Elastra raced down the winding stairs of the tower, eager to keep the impostor in sight. What was that light? It didn't seem like he was attacking anything, Anselm said between breaths, as he tried to jump several stairs at a time without tumbling into the wall. Of course he wasn't, you fool, she shouted back. It was some kind of signal. She held her hood on her head as she ran, her long golden curls sailing behind her. We've got to awaken the troops in the barracks. He wouldn't stand a chance against a full force of wardens. There's no time for that. The two of us can handle him, Elastra said. They finally reached the bottom of the winding tower stairs, and she nearly threw herself into the door. Together they stumbled into the wide stone hallway. It was well lit with torches and tapestries lining the walls in between small glass windows. It was utterly silent. We have to get to the royal chambers as quick as we can, she hissed, looking around. But there could be more of them, Anselm said. We should split up. Are you mad? Elastra's hair whipped at him as she turned her face close to his. We can't let whoever that was reach the king. Where else would he be going? And if we run into him, you will need my strength. Her tone of superiority stopped him for a fraction of a second. He knew she was right and despised it. Before he could make a conscious decision, he was running behind her down the hall toward the set of stairs that would lead them out of the warden wing and into the castle proper. On the way, he corrected her a few times on which hall led where, shaking his head and grumbling at the irony. Her hexes always made her forget. They grew more and more uneasy as they continued through the suspiciously empty halls. As they crossed under the archway into the walls of the castle itself, they could hear the faint echoes of shouting and clashing steel above them. A quick survey of the wide hall in which they stood revealed several handmaids cut open on the floor, their burdens spilled from their baskets. Quick! Elastra called. She was off again as quickly as she had stopped. As they rounded the corner, they both stopped short in shock. A small group of Tritus knights stood with weapons at the ready. Most of them wore pieces of armor over sleeping garments or day clothing, but all bore shields and a hybrid expression of confusion and determination. Before them, 30 bodies of their comrades lay dead, piled among the crippled and maimed bodies of at least twice that many Gruuls. Gruuls armed and wearing the emblem of Talgarth. The knights, taken by surprise at their appearance, nearly charged them, but a cumulative sigh of relief soon replaced their vigor. Wardens! One shouted as he ran forward. He dipped his head in a quick bow to Anselm, and a slightly deeper one to his sister. Sage Elastra. Anselm grimaced at the formality. Even in the dim light of the halls, Anselm could see the soldier was covered in sweat and the dark stains of Gruul blood. What's happening? He demanded. Gruuls bearing the crimson sun attacked us from inside our walls, but from where we know not, the soldier responded. Commander Arvis has led as many of the men as he could gather to the gates, while the rest of us hold the halls. It is still unclear, but there seem to be many more outside than in. If they take the gates, he trailed off. Elastra was frowning at the corpses on the ground, and Anselm voiced her thoughts. Talgarth uses even these brutes as their pawns, he spit. They disgrace the art of war. How fares the king? Where is he? Elastra snapped at the soldier. I'm afraid I cannot say, Sage Elastra. We were stationed here to keep them as far from his chambers as possible, and that is all I have been told. Many of the wardens have gone to the east halls to stop them there. Well, we can't waste more time here, Anselm broke in. We will go on and see to the king. Even as he spoke, the soldier drew up his sword, as a group of shrieking Gruuls turned a corner further down the hall and charged in their direction. Anselm and Elastra pushed through the guards and were running through the maze of hallways when the foul creatures met the soldiers, steel screeching on crooked blades. They passed several other groups of defending soldiers as they worked their way toward the north wing of the castle, with shorter conversations at every pause. Anselm was pleased to find many of his warden comrades and even a fellow captain among them, and hoped the rest were faring well wherever they were. They quickened their pace as they drew closer to their destination, noticing the groups of Tritus defenders growing thicker and the corpses more abundant. As they had suspected, much of the enemy's strength had been focused on this section of the castle. Fate keep the king. I hope we aren't too late. At last they reached a large pillared courtroom. Against the far wall, tall ornate doors led to the royal throne room and beyond to private halls of the king's chambers. Their hearts rose and they breathed a sigh of relief. A group of 50 men stood at the ready, heavily adorned with the thick steel of Tritus armor and broad shields bearing the mark of the cloud-capped Titan. The row in the back held drawn longbows and stood poised, ready to unleash a storm of poison-tipped shafts into any assailant that appeared at the end of the long court. The soldiers in the middle of the body were brandishing swords, and the remaining men at the front, 10-foot lances fit to take down a fully armored warhorse and its rider. A dozen wardens stood with them, ready to repel any enemy. The king was still safe. For now. The captain of the group quickly called for his men to hold, as he immediately recognized the wardens dashing toward them. He lifted his helmet's visor from over his eyes and shouted to them. "Well met, wardens. Sage Alastra. What news have you?" "We know nothing but what we saw in our coming," Alastra said as they closed in on him. "The defenses set in the halls grow thin. If they keep coming, they will be upon us soon." The captain's expression of horror shifted to Anselm as he continued the tale. "A warden of Talgarth is in the castle. He released a signal above the city from the tower, and we believe he is on his way here. We must get through to protect the king." "Stand aside," the captain called out to his men almost before he could finish his sentence. "Let the wardens through." Anselm snorted as they rushed into the field of metal toward the chamber doors. "If Ella weren't here, they would have skewered me for a Talgarth spy. I guess I would rather have a sage as a sister than 100 of those arrows sticking in my back." The doors closed behind them. Caleb and his father Damon leaned against a cracked brick wall in a crevice between two buildings, the chaos of battle lying in an orange haze of fire just out of view. Several other townsmen and soldiers from the castle stood with them, all panting in unison as they tried to take advantage of the short break before rushing back into the fray. Caleb held his sword ready in one hand and leaned with the other on bended knee, his weak gruel shield long since shattered. He looked around at his comrades. All of them bore cuts and bruises, and one was even assisting another to bandage a damp pool on the back of his head. All of them were shooting wondrous glances at Damon's sword as he leaned on it for support. Its blade was spattered with the blood of gruels and men alike, but shone bright with a mirror-like finish as if it had never seen battle. Even amidst the grave circumstances, the men looked on in awe as if the sight of it eased their minds and cured their wounds. The rumors were true. Damon Rembrandt was in possession of the hallowed blade, the weapon crafted by fate himself. Caleb couldn't help but stare with the others, as he wiped the sweat from his brow with the end of his nightcloak. The conflict had raged on for 30 minutes, an eternity for battle, and the gates still held. From where they stood they could see smoke rising in other parts of the city, but it seemed it had not gone much further east than the city's central point. The enemy numbers seemed thinner now, as the conflict seemed to be coming to an end. Just then, Caleb heard a familiar voice further up the alley, in the opposite direction of the battle. He turned and nearly fell over with shock when he saw Layla down the street, gathering a few broken ends of weapons from the dirt. He called her name and raced toward her. When she saw him coming, she dropped the load from her arms and met him for an embrace. Her red hair hung carelessly around her shoulders, and her face was smeared with dust from the smoke and grease of the forges. She wore some sort of nightgown under light tin armor she had crafted herself, and thick leather gloves that nearly reached her elbows. She wore dark boots and a sheathed sword at her waist. Caleb could tell from the condition of her armor and the frightened look on her face that she had not been fighting. For that he was grateful. "Layla, what in fate's name are you doing here?" he gasped, holding her tightly. "You should be somewhere safe. There are gruels and Talgarth soldiers at every turn." It all made sense when the next visitor came down the alley. An ox of a man with a red face marched in behind her, hauling a large cart with weapons of every kind piled high. A mound of swords, both old and new, whole and broken to pieces, took up the bulk of the cart's space, along with woven baskets stuffed with arrows and bowstring. Shields bearing the Titan mountain of Tritus as well as the Crimson Sun were amongst the haul as well. The man nearly ran to cover the distance to his daughter, and then dropped the cart's handles to the dirt and wiped his face with a rag. He was mostly bald, and one glance at his black working apron and customized armor announced him as the blacksmith, Kane Starlahand. The fool girl wouldn't stay while her brothers and I left to help. She's as comfortable in Starlahand armor as she is in a dress, that one, he said as he shot a quick look out into the street. Protecting his daughter as they went about aiding the fighters with fresh steel had seemingly worn on him more than the actual running had. Damon made his way over to Kane and they clasped wrists. "Your help is much appreciated, old friend," Damon said. Kane's eyes fell almost instantly to the famed sword for a moment. "I knew I would find you here, always closest to the battle, Mr. Rembrandt," he said. He gave a nod to Caleb also. Although he had known his father for years, Kane still addressed him as Mr., out of respect. He was the bearer of the ancient sword, after all. "Here I am, just recovering from supplying the Grimhall campaign, pushing my workers day and night, and now this. Ain't enough steel to go around, I tell you." Caleb wasn't sure if he was concerned about the city as much as his trade. As the two exchanged news from other parts of the city, the other men in the alleyway prepared to finish the conflict, rummaging through the cart for sharper swords and bowing in thanks. Caleb, his soldier ear still half listening to his father's conversation, turned his attention back to Layla. "You should not have come. You are dancing with death every moment you remain out here." "I couldn't stay at home." Although coated with fear and anxiety, her voice was solid as stone and could hardly be challenged. "My mother and the handmaids are safe under the homestead, with a few of father's hired hands. My brothers should be somewhere nearby." She was looking around with a distant expression. "So many bodies," she trailed off. The last was almost inaudible under the ever-present clamor of nearby fighting. Caleb held her closer and gritted his teeth. She never should have to have seen something like this. Not here. Not in Tritus. "You're hurt," she said, pulling away enough to observe the dozens of cuts on his face and hands. He shook his head. "Nothing serious. You ought to stay here with your father while we go back and end this. We think the worst of it may have passed. The castle gates still stand." Her father and Damon came up behind her. "Yes," Kane said. "Come, Layla, this place is not safe, but will have to do for the time being." He drew a sturdy axe from his belt. "Get behind the cart." The cry of a dying man sounded just around the corner, making Layla hurry along. She squeezed his hands one last time as he exchanged his battle-worn sword for a fresh blade. "Be careful," was all she could say. The other soldiers had already left the alley. Damon nodded at his son, and they dashed back out into the night. Despite her father's warnings, Layla followed to the edge of the building that secluded them and watched Caleb go. Anselm stood next to Alastra in the center of the throne room alone. The king was deeper yet in his personal chambers, no doubt with more armed men. If only High Sage Fridmorton had not left so quickly for Grimhall, Anselm thought. They needed him now more than ever. They stood listening to the sounds of battle raging just outside the tall doors to the courtroom. They could tell that Gruels had taken on the thick defense of soldiers, and were paying the price for it. Before hope could sink into them too much, they heard a sound they did not want to hear. "Ordnance!" a muffled soldier's voice shouted above the rest. They heard a volley of hexes and the ground shook as their fury assailed the walls and floor. Before Anselm or Alastra could do anything else, the world exploded around them. Their vision blurred into white light, and their ears rang as the doors shattered into thick shards of painted wood. Both of them flew off of their feet and hit the ground, rolling 10 spans back from where they had stood. As the smoke cleared, they rose, and saw the remaining soldiers burst into flames at the hands of 2 stalking figures marching toward them. Anselm recognized one of them as the man from the tower. "Sages," he mumbled as he pulled his sleeve cuffs up his arm. The scars in his palms were bright red. "Swords will do nothing against these ones." He and his sister, silently separated to opposite sides of the room. This fight would take strategy as well as sheer power. "If you're going to use those strong hexes, Ella, now would be a time I would encourage it. And you'll need me to cover your sorry hide while you do it." As the 2 men walked up the stairs and through the hole where the doors had been, the light flickering in the torches around the throne room cast eerie shadows on their figures. The one from the tower was taller and still wore his cloaked hood. His robes looked similar to that of the warden robes of Tritus but were mostly black, fastened with buckles and belts. A macabre metal ornament that resembled a human rib cage was latched to his chest, making him look like a phantom from the underworld. The shorter man next to him wore similar attire but without a hood, revealing an aged, sinister face with a glare of ice. Above his eyes rested a strange golden circlet with a ruby at its center. The thing had a beauty about it that seemed out of place on his bony head. Anselm felt some temporary relief to see that their hands were at their sides. As long as they are not forming hexes, we're safe. The comfort of the thought was not as lasting as he wished it was. It could all change with the next heartbeat. "Stand aside," the older man said. "We have no meddling with you. We have come for King Hallis." Anselm smiled. "I think not, old man. You've stopped your parade through the castle because you know we can destroy you. Take one step further and we scorch your bones to ashes with your lioness soon to follow." He expected Elastra to say something, but noticed she was already focusing on the moment, watching the hands of the enemies intently, so as to be ready to form the countering hex once they made a move. The Talgarth wardens wasted no more time with words. The taller of the two brought his hands suddenly together, intertwining his fingers in the hex of the corrupt. Attack. Almost simultaneously, Anselm had his hands together and focused on a defense barrier. He knew how his sister worked and knew she was going to do what she always did, fight fire with fire. Defend by meeting the attack with another attack. In that fraction of a second, Anselm was glad that he and Elastra knew each other so well. In this case it could save their lives. As he made the hex and started to draw on the power he would need, his mind suddenly stopped as if his thoughts had hit a rock wall and ricocheted backwards. As he strained to push through, he found the source of the hindrance. The other warden with the circlet was holding Anselm's mind back in confusion, like a weaker form of the hex his sister had played on him earlier. Anselm could tell the old man's focus was weak for some reason, and he tried to break free. The tall man in the hood unleashed a whirl of fire from his hands, but as it sailed toward the two of them, Elastra released her energy back. A burst of water erupted in a circle around her, and a wave that nearly touched the ceiling raged toward her assailant with deadly speed. It enveloped the flames and weakened only a little before plowing into the two men in black. Their yells were cut short as it crashed over them, driving them into the floor. Anselm felt his mind free again, and hastily formed the protection hex over the two of them, retaining the hex formation of his hands to keep it alive. He grinned. Orta was a simple hex, not the most effective for fighting but, as he would expect from his sister, a perfect counter-attack that not only took their opponents off their feet but bought him time. The Talgarth men rose quickly to their feet. The taller was calling another attack even as he stood, and the older man was gripping the circlet on his head. "Don't lose control of it, you old lech," the taller yelled to the shorter. "Get behind me." He launched his next attack with no delay. A tremor of energy sailed through the ground toward Elastra, uprooting stone and red carpet in its wake. With a yelp, she dashed toward her brother, knowing the defense barrier would not protect much from an attack from the ground. A crater exploded where she had stood seconds earlier, as she dove and rolled to Anselm's feet. While she recovered, Anselm released the barrier and fired off strings of lightning from his newly formed hex, sending the men back. The older Talgarth sage brought his hands to the circlet again before jumping out of the way. When the light from the flashing faded, Anselm and Elastra took cover behind a nearby pillar, screened by the smoke and debris from the decimation. "What is that circlet?" asked Anselm, shooting a glance out from behind their cover. "They're protecting that thing more than one another." "I noticed," Elastra said hastily. There was no more time for conversation. "Come out, you wretches. I'll skin you alive," the man from the tower yelled. Apparently, he had not seen where they had gone. But if they waited concealed any longer, they would soon be dead. "Don't let them play any more tricks," she said. "They are skilled, but the old one is distracted with that head jewel. I'll feign an attack. When he launches a counter, I'll switch to a protection hex. You fire anything you've got, and while they deal with that, I'll give them a second hex to play with. Got it?" While Elastra spouted orders, Anselm listened without question. His sister was gone and a sage was before him. Anselm nodded, and she was off. It all happened in seconds. Alastra emerged, and sure enough, the tall man hurled a stream of purple lightning with a shout of anger. In the heat of the moment, Anselm found himself going against his better judgment and calling upon a second-degree hex, a stronger power than he felt comfortable with. A burst of white light blazed from his spot behind the pillar and consumed the two wardens. He could tell the majority of the hit had been repelled by the smaller man who was still doing his best to support the taller, but it did not hold for Alastra's follow-up. She stood with her hands above her head, forming the hex of a second degree as well, her hair whipping in the current of power surrounding her. The two men looked like bugs, as their bodies were lifted off of the ground in a grip of invisible webs. They struggled only for a moment, the taller man yelling for the glory of Talgarth before 1,000 needles of red light roared toward them in a wall of certain death. Each needle pierced them through from head to toe, illuminating into one bright light that blazed an inferno in the air. Their screams died away with the light, and when it was gone, so were they. On the floor were 2 pairs of scorched cloth. The room was in utter ruin. The wall that once held the doors was completely gone now, and the floor was torn apart by the upheaval of the sage's hex. Smoke streamed from tiny fires everywhere but where the remaining water touched, making it seem as though they stood in a giant extinguished furnace. Anselm walked to his sister, crouching on one knee and panting. Using second-degree hexes in quick succession had left her exhausted, and he knew she was experiencing the strange sensation of more memories being pulled from her mind. A feeling she was likely accustomed to. She accepted his hand, and with some effort he pulled her up. Together they walked to the burning mound where the sages once stood. "Let's hope that's all they've got for now," Anselm said. "A few more of these and we're done for." He kicked the rags of the older man with an air of disgust, and was surprised when the ruby-crested circlet clanged against the floor. He looked at his sister, who just shrugged, and he scooped it up. The piece was whole and sturdy and much lighter than he had expected. It was a beautiful thing indeed, with several bands twisting to make up the whole, and he was surprised to see that the metalwork was only slightly dimmed with black smears. It winked at him in the dim light of the 2 remaining torches that still breathed. How could this have survived that hex? He asked, more to himself than to Alastra. "It is a trinket of Talgarth," she panted, running her fingers through her jumble of thick blonde hair. "Leave the thing to rot with its makers. We've got to go on and see if King Hallis is here." Anselm nodded slowly. Why would he be so worried about protecting this old thing, even if it meant sacrificing his focus on the fight? "I suppose if it weren't for this, we would be the ones that became ashes." He flicked the ornament, making it ring. "Come." His sister beckoned again. She turned and walked toward the back of the throne room, where another hall led to the king's private quarters. Anselm rotated the circlet in his hands, looking at it from different angles and watching the light bounce on the large ruby in the center. He was half in the motion of dropping it when he stopped and smiled. "Spoils of war. Any treasure that's worth that much to Talgarth I'll gladly keep, even if it becomes a plaything for the dogs." He dropped the thing in his satchel and followed Alastra. Had he known what it was capable of, he would have heeded her suggestion to leave it behind.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.